Welcome everybody. This is the first session in our Dadao series. I should say Practical Dao series, because that's actually the first thing I want to address. I want to touch on some historical points, because with this Dadao, I think it's like with the Miao Dao, there's a tendency to sort of lump it all together. And we think like, okay, Miao Dao means there's one Miao Dao or something like that. Same thing with Dadao. That's not the case. There's quite a few different forms, or at least from what we can tell, there were a variety of forms in use, probably from the Qing dynasty well into the Republic. So this form that we're going to be working on is one that I'm recreating from a manual that was published in 1933 by Enzhong, who was a military officer. And it's, I think, very interesting one, and it could be hopefully very useful for our practice. Useful for our practice in that it's a rather short form. It's very straightforward. Take our Miao Dao form, for example, has 4 roads. It's condensed from an older, longer form, but it just has 4 lines or 4 roads that go back and forth. This has only 1 road, just 1 straight line. So it was a simple, direct, no-nonsense form. It was used to train troops during a time of war. So obviously, as its name is, it's a practical techniques for the Dadao is how you could translate the Chinese term. So I'll refer to it generally in short as a practical Dadao, or if you prefer, Jin's Dadao, after the author. But I think it's really important to remember, he stresses this in the introduction to say that unlike other Chinese sword forms that have fanciful moves, this doesn't. This is all oriented to be practical. So if you're wondering which Dadao, or maybe you didn't realize there were a number of Dadao forms, and these forms were used by different warlords during that period after the fall of the Qing. There are definitely different variations. You can find some old vintage film clips of them, and you'll see, oh yeah, they're quite different. And they were used as also kind of physical fitness. It's interesting because, of course, today, those practicing swordsmanship understand it has this martial spirit to it, right? It's not just exercise. It has form and function, although maybe in today's it seems rather obsolete. But it does have both, you have to work for physical attainment, but also there's some internal value or some spiritual side to it, if you will. Definitely has that martial spirit. And I think that's probably one reason why it was practiced in an age of firearms. Because as I said, by 1933, Japanese were already making incursions into northern China, into Manchuria. There already had been battles between Chinese and Japanese. So this was a time of war. So it's kind of curious. Why in the world, when men have rifles, bolt-action rifles that wouldn't be much different than rifles people use today for hunting, why would they be training with a weapon like this? And I think one simple reason for that is, practically speaking, the Chinese weren't as well equipped as the Japanese, as other nations, but also those rifles at that period, military rifles, they were bolt action, which was relatively slow, but also they only held 5 rounds. And so when you get in close, they didn't have magazines like modern military rifles do, where you could take out a magazine and put in another 30-round mag. You only had 5 rounds, came in a little strip clip, and you could have to push them in the top and then work the action to get it one in the chamber. And you can see that when troops get really close together, there might not be time to get out another 5 rounds out of its pouch and reload your rifle. And that's why all the armies at the time, Chinese, Japanese, European, and American armies, all practiced with bayonets. And bayonet fighting was something that really went on. So in that kind of case, and we should understand that Jin's manual is entirely described facing a man with a rifle and a bayonet. In some ways, you could say it's historically parallel to the Dadao manual from hundreds of years earlier, 400 some years earlier, where that long saber is being used to deal with and directly face a spear. So in this case, in the case of a rifle about so long with a bayonet on it, that's like a short spear. In a way, you could say this is a Chinese way of dealing with a spear. So it's very similar. You'll see movements that are very similar to other sort of Chinese sword forms that we've practiced. Some movements are exactly the same, or very minor difference in other forms that we practice. So it's very interesting historically, and it was at a time where still relevant, sort of still, someone might argue this, but relevant on the battlefield, because you had just, men didn't have all of the ammunition, all the supplies they really needed. They had Chinese, of course, had a strong martial tradition to draw on, but also practically speaking, when men got really close in the trenches or when the front lines came together, you might have been out of bullets or just not had that moment to load again, and you're getting into bayonet fighting. And so the Chinese were armed with these. So that's where our Dadao comes from. So it's coming from a long history, a long tradition in China. These were very popular in use in the late Qing by, you might call militia forces, constabularies, Qing troops, Qing officials, and their minions, if you will, who were responsible for dealing out kind of sometimes rough street justice. These were often used to behead criminals or any kind of malcontents on the road. So they were popular with those sort of militias and we might call irregular forces. A lot of times they were what we might think of as security patrols, not quite like police today, but playing that sort of role. So this is not just the modern tradition. This is drawing on a much older tradition that was quite prevalent, quite popular during the late Qing. So what is a Dadao? That's the other thing we want to address real quickly, because I think maybe there's probably a lot of different ideas about what it is. If you look at the blade, and this is one from the Taiping Rebellion, and I'm choosing to use this, train with this one, present the seminars with this, because it has the same sort of tip as the one illustrated in Jin's manual. That is a pointed tip like this. More typically, I think everybody's more used to seeing this sort with a more angular tip. And if you'd like to see more about this one, you can go on our YouTube channel, Great River Taoist Center's YouTube channel, and look up Qing Dadao, and you'll see this one in greater detail, and I discuss it more. But if you notice, this sort of blades are usually around 28 inches or so. They're not really long blades. So although these swords are clearly set up for a two-handed kind of use, or they can be used for that option of a two-handed use, they can easily be wielded with one hand. And so I think that's one sort of defining characteristic of the Dadao, is that it is essentially a single-hand saber that has this extended grip so you can use it with two hands. Many, the older ones, and this is of course hard to say because these are not pattern weapons. So it's the other thing I want to make clear. This one I quite like. I love the way it handles. I love the shape of the blade. I like the way, personally, the way the tip comes down so that you can effectively use a thrust. Sometimes these tips are not quite as angular as this, so the thrust would be a little less efficient. But remember, think about the period when these are being employed. This is, late Qing and in the early Republic, people were making these, and even volunteer groups that wanted to support the Chinese military made these. So they're not being made by any kind of pattern. You find fairly wide variations in length, curvature, and in particular also how much it will widen. Some of them will widen in a much greater fashion than this, a much more marked increase as you go down the blade, which makes them so that you can't handle them well with one hand. So you do find quite a bit of variety. So when we're talking about Dadao, you may, especially if you look at old images of these, you can find quite a few images of men during the Second World War or just before the Second World War and during the Second World War carrying these on their back as a backup weapon. Some troops, the Dadao Dui is a famous, the big knife unit, if you is literally translated, was famous for using these, but there isn't a set style. So that's why you'll see these older ones, it seems, tend to have more of this S-shaped guard. Both of the ones that I have are this way, but also you'll see them with stubby little guards, and occasionally you can find it with a round guard. So So there's a variation. So keep in mind, this is not a pattern weapon. It's not like a typical Qing saber, something of that fashion that was made by one forge or centralized kind of forges that produced them in large numbers for the military. So a Dadao, but generally speaking, I would say, what's a Dadao? It's a single hand weight and length and balance blade, often with this clip tip that seems to be more common, but also with a standard sort of tip. Can usually be wielded with one hand, but is set up so that you can more likely use it with two hands. Almost universally, they have this round bit here, and I think that's simply because you don't usually find the older ones with any sort of scabbarding. That's extremely rare, and usually when they have a scabbard, it seems to be a later addition. So I'm thinking that is because simply you can hang it up on the wall. I don't think it's because you're going to slip off of here. I don't think it's for tying anything on there. I think that's martial lore. I think that's just simply, doesn't come scabbarded. You hang it up someplace like that, convenient. But who knows? There's no way to say for certain. Last thing before we jump into the form here is why the two-handed use? Because this period, late Qing, early Republic, you know, there's plenty of single-handed swordsmanship. Two-handed swordsmanship was not the prevalent kind. Why two-handed swordsmanship? Probably because the vast majority of people, all of a sudden having to use these, were farmers, peasants, working people. And what kind of weapons, or excuse me, what kind of tools do they normally use? Axes, threshers, shovels, hoes, all of the tools that you're going to find a Chinese farmer using daily. You know, got the hoe like this, and chopping wood, right? Threshing grain, which is just a pole with another piece on the end, right? This is also used as a weapon. Almost all these kinds of weapons, or should say tools, are two-handed. So it's a very easy transition for a peasant or a farmer or a worker who's used to using, I keep saying weapons, tools with two hands to feel confident and have some sense of security with a weapon that can be wielded easily with one hand, right? That you can definitely use and move with one hand, but to feel like, okay, I got my two hands and I can at least hit him really hard. So sometimes in the past, I've referred to these not as Dadao, but as Qi Dao. In other words, Qi means rebellion. Rebellion sabers, like this one with its Taiping markings that very clearly show that it was from the Taiping rebellion. It was carried by a rebel because those people who rebelled against the empire were not soldiers, were not trained martial artists, just common folk, which were mostly farmers. They were used to using tools and shovels and things with two hands. This was an easy sort of transition for them. So from the late Qing to the early Republic, these were in widespread use, largely by people who were either militias or rebels. All right, so that's a quick historical background. Let's jump right into the form.